Yes, and we will keep in touch. Questions? Thanks a lot, Frank. Go ahead, sorry.
Thank you. So I have one comment on most of the problematic cases that you pointed out, like seeing how similar the voice of potential new employees to existing employees. I think it's due to the fact that most of the learning algorithms, or at least classification algorithms that are out there, are based on the principle of nearest neighbors. So most of them boil down to having positive and negative examples, and we see, is it closer to the positive or to the negative examples, and make the decision based on that. And what most of those approaches fail is putting distances into account in areas where we haven't explored training data, the search space enough. Diversity is the best real-world example. So a lot of people say we need a more diverse workforce because they bring in new ideas, they bring in new creativity, there's potential which we haven't exploited. And most of the algorithms that we use for classification explicitly work in the other direction. So I think what we need are techniques, although I'm not an expert on that specific area, there are some areas in machine learning which typically are referred to these maximum entropy principles, which try to actually, if we can't make a decision, let's make it as broad as possible, that space. I haven't seen a lot in the area of classification, but I think that's one way to go to avoid those problems that you say, just because someone sounds dissimilar to our good people, doesn't mean that person is bad. If he sounds like all the bad ones, this may be a better indicator, if you believe in voice is a criterion. I think we have to work on that with respect to the algorithm that we are using.
Go ahead.
Oh yeah, to respond to that, I think, yes, and what I particularly like about your example is it reminds me of, I was reading a book by Pedro Domingos called The Master Algorithm, and he was sort of talking about different forms of machine learning. And it reminds me of the tension between explore versus exploit, if you're trying to find the local or global maxima for a solution. And and it dramatizes the fact that what might seem like a dry and technical decision as to this type of algorithm you use actually has enormous political implications if you choose one that does more exploration versus less exploration. So thank you. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Amy?
Thanks for the talk, Frank. Fantastic, as always. I wondered if you could say something about, you mentioned this emphasis or this need for regulation, and you also mentioned NGOs and sort of grassroots organizations, and we can see things like Bits of Freedom, Algorithm Watch, Big Brother Watch popping up, having an impact, opening up a black box, so to say. And we also see the European Commission creating principles, Canada, Toronto Declaration, Montreal Declaration, and whatnot. Where do you see the most promise? Is it the grassroots that's going to have the largest impact, or does this have to be a top-down initiative?
Ideally, I want to see both, but I do think that you're absolutely right, Amy, that it's where to choose to invest resources is important. I think that right now the hardest card of this problem is to make it politically understandable. I've had about 10 opportunities to deal with the U.S. Congress and agencies in the U.S. over the past couple of years, and it is extremely difficult to get a sense of how these systems work in an intuitive way. And I think that the more that the grassroots can do that, the better. I do think that the best example recently has been on facial recognition, where I think that there's been, the grassroots has been sort of ahead of a lot of the academic community in terms of anticipating some of the most negative uses. But I applaud all of those efforts to set up the guidelines, and the HLAG here in Europe was, I thought, very, very helpful. So, yeah.
Marcelo?
Congratulations for your paper. In theory, the banks are created to help the poor people, but in the criteria to give the money, what is the choice? Your normal choice, the rich people to give the money in all these criteria. So this is one thing. The other thing is, what about the corruption? Because we know that all the movement of the traffickers go for the banks, and you can control this with these new criteria. So in what way this artificial intelligence could be useful for give money to the poor people and to control the corruption?
And Frank, let me add, yesterday I gave a rosy picture for expanding financial services to where they do not exist. What do you compare with? I compared with no access to financial services, the normal situation of the bottom 2 billion, And so what do you compare with, the before and after?
I was going to say that one of the, and I'll take the questions in reverse order, if that's all right. And I to directly respond, absolutely. And I was the problem is that we're going to face. I compare it to medicine, right? With respect to medicine, there are these systems that can be used, say, in lesser developed countries that are clearly inferior to, say, having the system plus a trained medical professional, but it's clear you would allow the system to be used in a less developed country because there are no medical professionals, right? And by the same token, if you have absolutely no other access to credit, who am I to say, to stop someone from making the bargain, here's my phone, download everything on it, monitor me 24/7 so that I have a chance to get to the market. I can't see stopping that transaction there. I will stop that transaction in the US because I think that in the US it's a rich enough country that that should not be the choice set on offer, right? So I do think, but it is a very difficult question because it's creating a bit of a two-tier problem. I think with respect to the issue of corruption that the Bishop has mentioned, you know, I think that that is something that I really hope that large-scale analysis of financial records can help us get to the bottom of that. There's a guy named Arthur Cofield in Canada who worked with the Panama Papers initiative to try to help them do some forms of big data analysis. And I do hope for that. But the problem there is, and this has been a big focus of my recent work, the data is so bad. So once you have a good set of data, AI can do amazing things with it. But the data about who owns which company that owns which company that owns which company, et cetera, that sort of data is often hard to find. And with respect to helping the poor in general, I have to think more deeply about it. I think Joachim's examples yesterday were very good about, you know, some of the opportunities created. But I also think that ultimately we may be asking the credit system to do something that's a bit more than it's capable of.
Mm-hmm. Nobuo-san?
Thank you. It is very interesting and insightful presentations. I have a question about the possible nationalization of the information, credit information. So you introduced some arguments of whether who should own the credit information. Then actually in Japan, even the numbering for the taxpayers face a really big challenge, protest by the people. And then and in China, on the contrary, I think the information of the consumption by Alipay is stored by Alibaba. Then it's a kind of open secret that this information is all sent to the government, right? So then, in the United States, are there any discussion or arguments that the nationalization of the credit information would be something that against kind of a freedom of the people or something?
It is, with respect to the data, I would, and I think that's a really interesting comparison with respect to Japan and China and the US there. What's fascinating about China is I think that the data clearly is, getting to the government and could be used with respect to a nationalized scoring system. Although even there are many scholars who emphasize, who caution commentators from exaggerating the current capacities of the Chinese government. People like Roger Cremiers and Shehzad Ahmed have said that, in fact, it's a highly fragmented system and it's harder than you would think for the government to actually access the data. But I think clearly that's part of the outline for a social credit scoring system from 2014 to 2020, that state document that was released in 2014. With respect to the scoring system, I think China is relatively open to the financial intermediaries doing their own scoring. And in the US as well, I think that it's going to take a long time. We've only now got insurance law scholars in the US who are realizing the scope of the problem. And the way they frame it is that you can't, if you allow big data systems to determine the terms of credit underwriting, you effectively can't enforce laws against discrimination. Because anything you'd want to stop them from discriminating against, there's a big data proxy for. Even something as simple as zip code in a segregated society could be used for that. So I think we're slowly coming to the point where there's a realization that we have to I would say re-juridicize this, and by that I mean make it more like a narrative-driven legal process, because it is so hard to apply law within these systems.
Last, Henrik.
Thank you so much for the presentation. Just a very short comment. It seems to me that there's a danger of a sort of vicious cycle when it comes to actually monitoring these things. And your Chinese example about monitoring in schools, you know, who dozes off, who is actually attentive. Because if you are to fight that, and you talked about trade secrecy, right? The fact that a lot of these things can happen and can be developed without us really knowing. Just imagine if we had here a small eye that we didn't even see, that monitored whether we were the perfect conference guests. So maybe we weren't invited again next year. There is, yeah. In order to monitor that again, you would need a lot of surveillance. So in order to stop a private police state, you would need a public police state in order to make sure that these things are not here. Say you had the authorities coming in first to check that there was not this kind of surveillance system. So you get a sort of vicious cycle. And of course, these things are fully implementable, technically speaking. So it makes me really think about the ways in which we are already surveilled every day, but the sort of opportunities that are there, unfortunately. And that also plays to Cyril's excellent point about, well, then in the end, diversity is what you lose in addition to individual rights.
Mm-hmm. Just say very quickly in response that I think, yes, that infinite regress of surveillance is a real problem, but I think that one way to deal with it is to say that a corporation of a certain size is subject to a lot more surveillance than an individual person. And I know that at least and that that's proper, and that at least in U.S. Fourth Amendment jurisprudence, which governs surveillance, that is the rule, that if you compare the jurisprudence about people versus large corporations, they sort of assume the risk of being surveilled by virtue of the social license granted via a corporate charter. But I also think that you're right to say that, yeah, you don't want to have a world of spy versus spy, of that sort of thing. And we already see companies monetizing this, like LinkedIn. You can monetize. You can pay so that you can see who looked at your profile, but they can't see that you looked at their profile, right? and this, I think, is sort of a road to madness if it goes all over the place. It can be a little bit of a worrisome trend in these other areas. But I do think that, yeah, you want to have to balance power, you need to have a strong state that is constrained with respect to its actions against individuals, but empowered with respect to its actions against large entities, powerful actors in society.
Mm-hmm. That you introduced conflict theory, functionalist theory, pointed to issues of regulation, pitfalls of trade secrecy, all extremely relevant. Thank you so much.